My mom's new husband hit me and ruined my life. I begged my mom for help, but she turned her back on me. Desperate, I called my real dad. He dropped everything and drove 950 kilometers to save me. Hi Reddit, it's me, Kayla. I don't even know how to start this. Every time I think back, I feel like I'm watching someone else's life. Like a movie where the main character keeps hoping for something good, but the world keeps knocking her down. But this isn't a movie. It's my life. I was 13 when my world started cracking at the seams. Some kids get blindsided when their parents split up. One day everything's fine, the next their dad is packing bags. That wasn't me. I saw it coming for years. My parents, Vanessa and Greg, didn't just argue. They fought like it was their full-time job. I don't remember a time when they were ever in love. Maybe they were once, before I was born, before the stress of life and money sucked them dry. But by the time I was old enough to notice, they were like two strangers who happened to live under the same roof. Mom had this way of making Dad feel small. She'd roll her eyes whenever he spoke, sigh dramatically if he tried to joke with her, correct every little thing he said. God, Greg, can you just stop embarrassing yourself? She'd snap when he stumbled over his words. Or, no one cares about your stupid job, when he tried to tell her about his day. Dad wasn't innocent either. He had a temper, and when he snapped, it was like a bomb went off. But it wasn't just anger, it was frustration. Like he'd been holding it all in for so long. And when it finally came out, it was ugly. They fought about everything. Money was the biggest one. Mom loved to spend. Designer bags, new shoes, expensive skincare routines. She wanted to look like the kind of woman who had it all together. Even though she didn't. Dad, on the other hand, was the one holding everything up financially. He worked long hours at a job he hated just to keep us afloat. You think I don't deserve nice things? Mom would snap. You think we can afford them? Dad would fire back. They fought about me too. My grades, my clothes, the fact that I didn't act excited enough when Mom bought me things. Once, she got me an expensive handbag for my birthday. I was turning 13. What the hell was I supposed to do with a handbag? I said thank you, but I guess my face wasn't convincing enough. I spend $400 on something nice for you, and you can't even pretend to be grateful? Dad had stepped in. Vanessa, she's a kid. She doesn't care about designer bags. That turned into a full-scale war. I'd learned early on to stay quiet, to keep my head down, to let their words slam into each other like wrecking balls while I hid in the background. But the final fight was different. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, trying to tune them out. It was late, maybe past midnight. Their voices cut through the walls like knives. You're a dead weight, Greg. A pathetic excuse for a man. Oh, and what are you, Vanessa? A spoiled, selfish brat playing pretend on Instagram. At least I have ambition. At least I want more than this sad excuse for a life. I squeezed my eyes shut. Please just stop. Then came the sound of something smashing. Glass. A plate. A vase. I sat up, heart hammering. Mom screamed. For one terrifying second I thought, did he hit her? But then I heard the front door slam so hard the walls shook. Footsteps storming down the driveway. A car engine roaring to life. Tires screeching. Silence. I crept out of my room, my hands shaking. Mom was standing in the kitchen, breathing heavily, glass shards scattered at her feet. She didn't look at me. What happened? I asked. She grabbed her phone off the counter, her face twisting into something cold. He's gone. And just like that, Dad was out of my life. A week later, he moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment across town. I only saw it once. It smelled like old carpet and microwave dinners, and there were barely any decorations, just a couple of framed pictures, including one of me. He had set up a makeshift bed for me in the corner, promising I could stay over whenever I wanted. But I didn't get a choice. Mom kept the house and I stayed with her. First, I thought maybe things would calm down. No more screaming matches. No more tension so thick it made my stomach hurt. But it wasn't better. It was worse. Mom didn't just ignore me. She acted like I was a burden. She was obsessed with her image, always posing for selfies, editing photos to look like a magazine cover. crafting this perfect online life where she was some independent woman thriving after divorce. But the reality? The house was a mess. Laundry piled up, dishes sat in the sink for days, and if I didn't clean up, no one did. She never asked how my day was. Never cooked dinner. If I was hungry, I had to fend for myself. If I wanted her attention, I had to practically beg for it. I still remember my 8th grade graduation. I stood on stage, searching the crowd, hoping to see her face. She never came. Later, when I asked why, she barely looked up from her phone. Oh, I totally forgot. Besides, it's not like it's a real graduation. That was my mother. If it didn't make her look good on Instagram, it didn't matter. Then Ethan happened. I don't know where she found him. Some dating app, probably. One day, she just announced it. I met someone. Like it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. A week later, she brought him home. Ethan was tall, had a slicked-back haircut, and a cocky smile that never quite reached his eyes. He tried too hard to be charming, asking me questions like, "What grade are you in? What do you like to do?" But it was obvious he didn't care. He was there for her, not me. And Mom? She glowed around him. I had never seen her like that, giggling, twirling her hair, acting like some teenager. It made me sick. A few months later, she dropped the bomb. "We're getting married," she announced, flashing a diamond ring. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You just met him." She rolled her eyes. "It's been 6 months. That's barely enough time to know if he snores, let alone if you should marry him." Mom scoffed. "God, Kayla, stop being so dramatic. We love each other." I wanted to scream, but it wouldn't have mattered, because Mom never cared what I thought. She never had. Mom's wedding to Ethan felt less like a family event and more like an Instagram photo shoot. She was obsessed with every little detail. Not because she cared about the marriage, but because she wanted everything to look perfect online. She spent thousands on a dress, hired a professional makeup artist, and even paid for a photographer who specialized in luxury aesthetic weddings. The guest list wasn't big, not because she wanted something intimate, but because she didn't have many real friends. She had plenty of Instagram friends, though, women who commented stunning, with heart emojis under her selfies, but wouldn't recognize her in real life if they passed her on the street. Most of them showed up just to take pictures, clinking champagne glasses for boomerangs and making sure the lighting was perfect for their own feeds. Ethan's family was there, though. His mother, Evelyn, a stiff, overly polite woman who looked like she had spent her entire life forcing smiles, and his younger sister, Holly, who didn't say much but watched everything like she was mentally gathering information for later gossip. Then there were his sons, Carter and Jake. I remember the first time I heard about them. "You're going to love having older brothers," Mom had gushed, her voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. I highly doubted that. Carter, the oldest, was 18. Jake was 16. I was only 14 at the time. They were both taller than me, had Ethan's sharp features, and the same smug expressions that made my stomach churn. They didn't talk to me at the wedding. Not really. Just a couple of nods, a muttered hey, and then they went back to their own world, laughing at their inside jokes and ignoring me completely. I tried not to care. But then Mom called me over for a family picture. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as the photographer positioned them perfectly under the golden wedding arch. Carter and Jake stood on one side, hands in their pockets, looking effortlessly at ease. And then there was me, forced to stand on the other side, dressed in an ugly, pastel pink dress Mom picked out, feeling like an outsider in my own family. The photographer kept telling me to smile. I did, or at least I tried. But when I saw the picture later, my face looked tense, uncomfortable, because that's exactly how I felt. A week after the wedding, Ethan moved in, and that's when everything changed. At first, it was subtle. He started acting like he was in charge of the house. Little rules, little corrections. "No phones at the dinner table," he said one night. Mom giggled and put hers away immediately. "Kayla, listen to Ethan." I gritted my teeth and obeyed. Then there were more rules. I needed to be more respectful to my mother. I needed to help around the house more. If I left my shoes in the hallway, Ethan took them away. If I forgot to wash a dish, he turned off the Wi-Fi. If I argued, he'd lower his voice and say, "You're being ungrateful, Kayla. Do you want to be treated like an adult? Then start acting like one." And Mom? She took his side. Every single time. But Ethan wasn't the only problem. Carter and Jake were worse. First, it was small things. They'd take the seat I was about to sit in at the dinner table. Oops, too slow. They'd turn off the TV when I was watching something and switch it to whatever they wanted. They'd laugh under their breath whenever I walked into the room. Then it escalated. One morning, I walked into the kitchen in my pajamas, bleary-eyed, reaching for a piece of toast. Carter snatched it right out of my hand and took a bite. "Thanks," he said, grinning. I clenched my fists, my face burning. "That was mine. What are you gonna do about it, little sis?" Jake snorted. "Seriously, it's just toast. Stop being so sensitive." Mom didn't even look up from her coffee. And just like that, they knew they could get away with anything. They started stealing my charger when my phone was at 5%, just to see me panic. They moved my backpack, forcing me to run around the house in the morning looking for it. Jake deleted an entire project from my laptop the night before it was due. When I confronted him, he just shrugged. "Not my problem," I told Mom. She sighed. "They're just boys, Kayla. You have to learn to get along. They're bullies." She gave me a tired look. "You're being dramatic." "And Ethan?" He smirked. "Maybe they wouldn't pick on you if you weren't so uptight all the time." I hated them. I started locking my bedroom door whenever I was inside. It was the only place in the house that felt like mine. Until one day, I came home and found it kicked open. The frame was splintered. My things were scattered. Carter and Jake were sitting on my bed, going through my stuff. Jake held up one of my bras, laughing. "Hey, Carter, I think this is your size." Carter smirked. "Maybe Kayla should actually wear it. Not that she needs one." I saw red. I charged at them, grabbing the bra and shoving Jake as hard as I could. "Oh," Carter taunted. "Look at her. She thinks she's tough." I didn't care. I started throwing things. Books, a hairbrush, whatever I could grab. Ethan came storming in. "What the hell is going on?" "They broke into my room," I yelled, my voice shaking. "They broke my lock." Ethan turned to his sons. "Is that true?" Jake smirked. "We were just messing around. No big deal." Ethan sighed, like I was the problem. "Kayla, you can't be so sensitive all the time. They're your brothers now. They're just having fun." That night, I cried myself to sleep. But the worst part? It hadn't even begun. Because the next time Carter walked past me in the hallway, he smacked my ass like it was nothing. I froze. My whole body went cold. "What the hell?" I snapped, spinning around. Carter grinned. "Relax, sis. It's just a joke." I stormed to Mom's room, shaking. "Carter touched me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" I gaped at her. "What do you mean, am I sure?" "Yes." She let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples. "Kayla, I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it." Something in me snapped. "You're taking his side?" She sighed. "Maybe you misinterpreted it." He grabbed me. My voice cracked. "Are you seriously not going to do anything?" Mom sighed. "I'll talk to him." She never did. From that point on, I avoided Carter at all costs. Never let myself be alone with him. Never turned my back to him. But he knew. He knew I was scared. And he loved it. And Ethan? He didn't care. If anything, he admired his sons. "You should take notes from them," he told me one day. "They know how to respect their family." Respect. That word didn't mean anything in this house. Nothing did. And I was trapped in it. I started spending as little time at home as possible. I stayed late at school, pretending I had club meetings. I spent hours at the library, reading books I wasn't even interested in, just to avoid going back to that house. Sometimes, I wandered around the mall, walking in and out of stores without buying anything, feeling invisible among the crowds. But I couldn't avoid home forever. Ethan started noticing. "You think you can just come and go whenever you please?" he asked one night, his voice calm, almost amused. I'm just studying at the library, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. Ethan took a slow sip of his whiskey, staring at me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. You don't want to be here, do you? I hesitated. No. The room went silent. Then, before I could react, he reached out and shoved me. Not hard. Not enough to knock me down. Just enough to send a message. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Mom saw it. She was standing in the kitchen, wine glass in hand, her nails tapping against the stem. For a second, just a second, I thought, she's gonna do something. She's gonna stand up for me. She didn't. She looked away. And that's when I knew. I was completely alone. The next time Ethan tried to discipline me, he wasn't subtle. It was late. The house was quiet. I had come home later than usual, my stomach twisting as I pushed open the front door, bracing myself for whatever was waiting. Ethan was in the living room, sitting in his usual chair, sipping from his glass like he'd been expecting me. Where were you? His voice was calm. Too calm. Library. Library's closed. I swallowed. I stayed outside to study. Ethan nodded slowly, then stood up. You think you can do whatever you want, huh? I'm not doing anything wrong. He stepped closer. Then he grabbed my wrist. Tight. Painfully tight. I yanked away, but his grip only tightened. His fingers dug into my skin, and I felt my heartbeat slam against my ribs. You don't run this house, he said, voice still calm, but his eyes were burning with something dark. I do. And if you keep acting like a spoiled little brat, I'll make sure you learn some respect. I twisted my arm again, my voice shaking. Let go of me. He did, but not before shoving me backward. I hit the wall. Not hard enough to bruise, not enough to leave a mark, but enough to send a message. Go to your room. I ran. Mom never asked what happened. She didn't want to know. But things with Carter were worse. I started locking my bedroom door every night. Even though it barely helped, even though my lock was already broken from when he and Jake kicked it in before. I stacked chairs against the door, wedged a suitcase against it. It wasn't enough. I could feel Carter watching me. When I walked through the house, I could feel his eyes on my back. When I sat at the dinner table, I could feel the way he smirked whenever I moved. He knew he scared me, and he loved it. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart stopped. The chair I had stacked against it had been moved. I held my breath, my body frozen in place. Then soft footsteps. A low chuckle. Carter. I clenched my fists under the blanket, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. Then, the footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, at breakfast, Carter looked right at me and grinned. I barely touched my food. Then Ethan got a promotion. I should have known something was wrong when I walked into the kitchen and found Mom practically beaming, clapping her hands together like she had just won the lottery. This is huge, she gushed. Ethan smirked, holding up a paper. Senior Executive Director. Carter and Jake cheered, high-fiving each other like Ethan had just scored the winning touchdown. Mom practically threw herself at him, planting a kiss on his cheek. Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you. I sat there, watching the scene unfold, feeling like an outsider in my own home. Then Ethan turned to me. You're awfully quiet, Kayla. I forced a smile. Congrats. Ethan smirked. And do you know what this means? It meant more money. It meant more power. It meant he'd be even more unbearable than he already was. But before I could answer, Mom gasped, like she had just had the greatest idea in the world. We should celebrate. Ethan grinned. I was thinking the same thing. He leaned back in his chair, stretching. I already booked it, actually. A full 2 weeks. All-inclusive resort. 5 stars. Private pools. The whole deal. Carter and Jake cheered again, already firing off questions. Where are we going? Do we get our own rooms? What kind of food do they have? Mom clapped her hands together. This is going to be amazing. I felt something stir in my chest. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be different. Maybe, for once, I wouldn't feel like an outsider. Maybe, for once, we'd actually feel like a real family. Mom was already rattling off plans, gushing about 5-star restaurants and spa reservations. Carter and Jake were watching videos of the resort, talking about jet skiing and parasailing. I didn't say anything, but deep down I was hopeful. For the first time in a long time, I actually had something to look forward to. Then, a few days later, I noticed something strange. Mom had packed everyone's suitcase. Everyone's, except mine. First, I tried to ignore it. Maybe she just hadn't gotten to mine yet. Maybe it was a mistake. But the next morning, I checked her packing list. Carter packed. Jake packed. Ethan packed. Mom packed. Me? Not even mentioned. A cold feeling crept into my stomach. I forced myself to sound casual. Hey, Mom. Do you want me to start packing my stuff? She hesitated. That was my first clue. Then she sighed, finally putting her phone down. Kayla, honey, about that. I felt my heart start pounding. What? She sighed again. This trip is going to be... well, it's a very expensive experience. I frowned. And... Mom pursed her lips. It's more of an adult vacation. I stared at her. Carter and Jake are going. They're older than you, she said quickly. Like that somehow made sense. I swallowed hard. I thought this was a family vacation. Mom gave me a long, careful look. Brian and I talked about it, and we think it'd be better if you stayed home this time. The words hit me like a slap. Stayed home. I let out a choked laugh. You're joking, right? Mom sighed. Kayla. Sweetheart. Don't make this difficult. Difficult? They were leaving me behind. And the worst part? Ethan was watching me from across the table, smirking, like he had won. I sat there, staring at my mother, waiting for her to say it was a joke, waiting for her to laugh, wave her hand, and tell me, of course you're coming, Kayla. You're part of the family. But she didn't. She just looked at me, waiting for me to accept it. My fingers curled into fists under the table. You're spending thousands of dollars on a vacation, and I'm not even invited? Mom exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples like I was the one being difficult. It's not like that, honey. This resort is very exclusive. Oh, I see. I cut in, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm not exclusive enough to go? Mom's patience snapped. God, Kayla, do you have to be so dramatic about everything? I glanced at Ethan. He was swirling the ice in his glass, watching me with that same smirk he always had when he knew he had one. Carter and Jake weren't even pretending to care. I pushed my chair back and stormed out of the kitchen. Mom didn't follow me. Of course, she didn't. I barely spoke to her for the next few days. She didn't seem to notice. She was too busy preparing for her vacation, chattering on the phone with friends about packing the perfect capsule wardrobe, and scrolling through resort pictures like she was already there. Carter and Jake were even worse, walking around the house, talking about how many girls they were going to hit on, how they couldn't wait to drink legally for the first time at the resort's VIP lounge. And Ethan? He was glowing. The more miserable I looked, the more satisfied he seemed. The night before they left, I stayed in my room. I didn't want to be anywhere near them, but I could hear them downstairs, laughing, clinking glasses in celebration. I stared at the ceiling, feeling numb. They were leaving me, and they didn't even care. The morning of their flight, I stood in the doorway as they wheeled their shiny new luggage out to the car. Ethan turned to me, his smirk lazy. Try not to burn the house down while we're gone, kiddo. Mom sighed like she was exhausted. Kayla, don't be like this. We'll be back before you know it. I said nothing. Mom leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to my forehead, like that somehow made up for everything. Then, before she got in the car, she slipped something into my hand. I looked down, a crumpled $50 bill. For food, she said, like she was doing me a favor. I didn't even have the energy to react. I just watched as they drove away, disappearing down the street. And then I was alone, again. 3 days before their flight, Mom had been forced to drive me somewhere. It was rare for her to do anything for me, But Ethan had taken her car to get detailed before the trip, which meant she had no choice but to use mine. We sat in silence, the air between us thick and heavy. I stared out the window, watching the rain hit the glass in thin streaks. Then Mom sighed dramatically, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel. You know, you're acting really childish about all of this. I turned to her, barely believing what I was hearing. I'm acting childish? She let out an exaggerated breath, like she was so tired of me. Kayla, this vacation wasn't planned to exclude you. Oh really? I let out a bitter laugh. You're spending $25,000 on a family vacation and somehow forgot to include your own daughter? Mom tightened her grip on the wheel. You don't get it. No, I get it. My voice was sharp. You and Ethan don't want me there. Just say it. That's not true. I scoffed. Then why wasn't I ever in the plans? She didn't answer. She just kept driving, her lips pressing into a thin line. I turned away, my heart hammering, anger mixing with hurt. The road was slick from the rain, the traffic heavier than usual. Mom was agitated, gripping the wheel too tightly, checking her phone at every red light. And then, headlights, a sharp turn, screeching tires, impact. The world flipped. Metal crunched like paper. Glass exploded around us. My body whipped forward, my seatbelt locking, pain slamming into my ribs. And then, blackness. When I woke up, I was floating. No, sinking. Drowning in pain, heavy and suffocating. My head throbbed like it was being split open. My whole body ached. There were voices muffled, distorted. Machines beeping. Bright white lights burned my eyes. Kayla? I blinked sluggishly. My vision swam. A blurry figure hovered over me. Mom? No. A nurse. Can you hear me? I tried to speak, but my throat was sandpaper. You were in an accident, the nurse said gently. You're at Riverwood General Hospital. Do you remember what happened? Flashes of the road. The impact. The screaming. I tried to nod, but a sharp pain shot through my skull. The nurse placed a hand on my arm. Your mother is fine. She only suffered minor scratches and bruises. She hesitated. But you? I waited. You have a fractured tibia, a concussion. We're keeping you for at least 10 days for observation. The words sank in slowly. 10 days. That meant the trip. I exhaled a weak, bitter laugh. Of course, this happens now. The nurse gave me a sympathetic look. I'll let the doctor know you're awake. Try to rest, sweetheart. She walked away. I closed my eyes. Exhaustion washed over me. The next time I woke up, Mom was sitting in the corner of the room, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. You're awake, she said, like it was an inconvenience. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something comforting. She didn't. Instead, she sighed. Well, at least now you have a reason to stay home. I thought I misheard her. What? She shrugged. The trip. You wouldn't have been able to go anyway. So really, this kind of worked out, didn't it? Something inside me cracked. I had spent years being ignored, overlooked, treated like an afterthought. But this was a new level of cold. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Are you serious right now? Mom gave me a tired look. Kayla, what do you want me to do? Cancel everything? I stared at her, my chest tightening. That's exactly what a normal parent would do. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Kayla, don't be dramatic. Ethan spent a lot of money on this trip. I felt like I was suffocating. You're seriously still going? Mom pursed her lips. We leave in 3 days. A hollow feeling settled in my stomach. She was still going. She was leaving me in a hospital bed to sip cocktails on a private beach. She didn't even care. And I knew in that moment I was truly nothing to her. I watched her waiting, begging for some sign of guilt, some hesitation, some proof that she actually felt something about leaving her own daughter behind. There was nothing. Mom sat there like this was just another inconvenience she had to deal with, like I had delayed her trip with my stupid little accident. She crossed her legs, adjusting the hem of her expensive dress, and scrolled through her phone, barely even looking at me. I could hear the faint sound of notifications, dings and vibrations, probably her friends commenting on her latest post. Probably something like, "Counting down the days until paradise," or "Ugh, you deserve this vacation so much, Queen." Meanwhile, I was laying in a hospital bed, alone. It was almost laughable. I had spent years telling myself that one day, she'd realize what she was doing, that she'd wake up and remember that I was her daughter, not just some extra thing that came with the house she kept after the divorce. But she wasn't going to wake up. She wasn't going to suddenly care. She was going to walk out of this hospital room and leave me here without a second thought. My throat was tight, my hands gripping the thin hospital blanket so hard my fingers ached. "You're really leaving?" It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Mom sighed, rubbing her temple like she was trying to be patient. "Kayla, I already told you Ethan planned this months ago. Everything is paid for. The flights, the resort, the excursions." I cut her off. "And that's more important than me?" Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't be so selfish, Kayla." I was selfish. Me. The one who had been left behind. The one lying in this hospital bed with a broken leg and a concussion while she packed her designer luggage and posed for vacation pictures. I almost laughed. The door suddenly swung open, and a nurse stepped in, checking the monitor beside my bed. She glanced between us, her expression shifting slightly when she picked up on the tension. "Everything looks stable," she said after a moment. Then, gently, "Kayla, do you have anyone else we can call? A family member?" I hesitated. Mom's eyes flickered toward me, just for a second. Then she sighed dramatically. "Oh, for God's sake, I already told her. Ethan's mother is checking in on her." The nurse's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And how often does she see Ethan's mother?" Mom didn't answer, because she knew the answer. "Twice. I had met Ethan's mother twice in my entire life." The nurse turned back to me. "Kayla?" I swallowed. My hands were clammy. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I had spent years believing I had no one. Years convincing myself that no one would come for me, that no one cared. But suddenly, an old, buried memory resurfaced. A voice. A deep, steady voice on the phone, months ago. "You can always call me, Kay. I don't care what your mom says. If you ever need me, just call." Dad. I blinked hard, my chest tightening. Could I? Would he even answer? Or worse, what if he had moved on? What if calling him proved that I was really, truly alone? The nurse's voice was soft. "Do you have someone, sweetheart?" I took a shaky breath. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, "Yes." The word came out stronger than I expected. Mom's head snapped toward me. "Kayla." I ignored her. I turned to the nurse, gripping the blanket so hard my knuckles turned white. "Call my dad." Mom let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, come on. He hasn't seen you in months. What makes you think he's going to drop everything and come running?" I ignored that too. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then, I said his number from memory. The nurse nodded, giving my hand a small squeeze before stepping out of the room. The moment the door shut, Mom stood up, shoving her phone into her designer purse. "You just love making things difficult, don't you?" I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She sighed, running a hand through her perfect hair, then grabbed her coat. "Fine. Call your father. See if I care." And then, she walked out, just like that. Not another word. No hesitation. No guilt. The door clicked shut behind her, and I realized something. This was the last time I was going to wait for her to love me, because I was done waiting. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I kept staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, waiting for the nurse to come back. What if he didn't answer? What if he had changed his number? What if... The door swung open. The nurse walked in, her eyes wide, slightly stunned. "Sweetheart," she said softly. "He's already in the car." My breath caught. "What?" She nodded. "He's coming. Right now." I stared at her, my mouth slightly open. "How far is he?" She glanced down at the notes in her hand. He's about 600 miles away. My stomach sank. That was too far. That would take. He said he'll be here in 6 hours. I felt my chest tighten. That's impossible. The nurse's voice was gentle. Sweetheart, I don't think he cares. I squeezed my eyes shut. For the first time in years, I let myself cry. Because for the first time in years, somebody was coming for me. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dark except for the dim glow of the monitors beside me. The steady beeping of my heart rate filled the silence. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was, my mind caught between sleep and reality. Then, like a sudden wave crashing over me, it all came rushing back. The accident, the hospital, Mom leaving, the nurse's voice, he's coming. He'll be here in 6 hours. I turned my head toward the clock on the wall. It had been nearly 5 hours since the call. My chest tightened. Was he really still coming? I didn't know what I'd do if he wasn't. A part of me, a dark, twisted part, kept whispering that this was a mistake, that I was about to relive the same feeling I had experienced my entire life. Being let down. What if he got tired halfway through the drive? What if he changed his mind? What if I wasn't worth the trip? I clenched the hospital blanket between my fingers, forcing the thoughts away. Then, footsteps. Fast. Urgent. I turned toward the door just as it swung open. And there he was. My dad. Elliot Walker, the man my mother had spent years ripping apart, stood in the doorway like he had just run straight through the hospital to get here. His chest was heaving, his gray t-shirt soaked with sweat. His dark hair was a mess, like he had run his fingers through it 1,000 times. His eyes, God, his eyes were wide and wild, scanning me like he needed to see for himself that I was still breathing. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a sharp, shaking breath. Jesus Christ, Kayla. His voice broke on my name. I swallowed, my throat dry. Dad. That was all it took. In a second, he was at my bedside, his hands hovering over me like he wanted to grab me, to hold me, but was afraid he'd hurt me. His eyes flickered over my injuries. My cast, the 4 in my arm, the fading bruises along my cheek. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. What the hell happened? He rasped. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't even know where to begin. The accident. Ethan. Carter. Mom leaving me behind. It all felt too big to say out loud. So instead, I whispered, "You actually came." Dad flinched like those words physically hurt him. Then, without hesitation, he lowered himself into the chair beside my bed and took my hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, like an anchor keeping me from floating away. "Of course I came," he said, voice thick. "You're my daughter." Something inside me cracked. I hadn't been anyone's daughter in a long time. The lump in my throat grew, burning like fire. My chest felt tight, and before I could stop myself, the first tear slid down my cheek. Dad saw. His grip on my hand tightened. His eyes, God, those eyes shined with something raw. "I should have been there sooner," he whispered. "I should have." His voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Kayla." I shook my head furiously. "It's not your fault." He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand over his face. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have." He stopped, exhaling sharply. "Tell me everything." I swallowed. And for the first time in years, I told the truth. I told him about Ethan, about the rules, about how everything changed the moment he moved in. I told him about Carter and Jake, about how they pushed and pushed, knowing no one would stop them. I told him about my broken lock, about the stolen schoolwork, about the way Carter would look at me like he was waiting for the moment I snapped. And then, finally, I told him about the vacation, about how they left me, alone, here. Dad didn't say a word as I spoke, but I saw it, the way his hand curled into a fist, the way his jaw locked, the way his breathing turned shallow and sharp. His entire body was wired with tension, like a bomb waiting to go off. By the time I finished, the room was thick with silence. I wiped my face, sniffing. "They didn't even hesitate, Dad." My voice shook. They just walked away. Dad exhaled a long, slow breath, but his hand was shaking. His knuckles were white from gripping the armrest of his chair. Then his voice, dark and dangerous. "They're never touching you again." My stomach flipped. "Dad!" No, he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. His entire body was tense, vibrating with fury. "I swear to God, Kayla, I will not let you go back there. Not ever." My throat felt tight. "Mom's never going to let that happen." Dad let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, she doesn't have a choice." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He turned to me, eyes burning. "I'm taking them to court." My breath caught. "What?" Dad clenched his fists. "I'm reporting them. All of them. Ethan, Carter, your mother. I'm reporting them to CPS." Shock rippled through me. I had dreamed about this for years. That someone would see. That someone would say, "This isn't normal. This isn't okay." That someone would fight for me. But now that it was happening, fear crept in. "What if nothing happens?" I whispered. Dad's face hardened. "Then I fight harder." A lump formed in my throat. I had never seen him like this before. I had always thought of my dad as the quiet one, the one who walked away when Mom picked fights, the one who let her win because it was easier. But this wasn't a man who was going to walk away. This was a man ready for war. And for the first time in a long, long time, I believed him. Dad didn't waste a second. The moment I told him everything, he was on the phone. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it, like a knife being sharpened. I could only hear pieces of the conversation, but every word made my stomach flip. Neglect. Verbal abuse. Endangerment of a minor. I want full custody. I sat there, gripping the hospital blanket, barely breathing. Was this really happening? For years, I had convinced myself that no one would ever fight for me, that I was too much trouble, that no one would choose me. But now my father was trying to burn the world down for me. When he finally hung up, his face was like stone. "CPS is opening a case," he said, his voice sharp. "And I already called my lawyer." I swallowed hard. "What happens now?" Dad exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "They're filing an emergency custody petition. But first," his jaw locked, "we're going to get proof." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Proof. I had never thought about that before. I had been so used to surviving that I never even considered proving what they did to me. But Dad? He was already 10 steps ahead. "We need records," he continued, his voice calm, steady. "Hospital reports, witness statements, text messages, anything that shows what they did." I opened my mouth, then closed it. I had never thought about it like that. Then slowly I realized I had proof. Not a lot, but enough. I swallowed, my hands suddenly cold. "I have screenshots." Dad's eyes snapped to me. "Of what?" I hesitated. Then carefully I told him. About the time Carter deleted my school project, and I had taken a picture of his text. "Oops. Guess you'll have to redo it," smiley face. About the bruises Ethan had left when he grabbed my wrist, and how I had secretly taken a photo before they faded. About Mom's messages to me, brushing everything under the rug. "You're exaggerating. Kayla, stop making drama where there is none." Dad's face grew darker with every word. "Send me everything." I nodded, my fingers shaking as I unlocked my phone. For the first time, those screenshots weren't just memories of things I wanted to forget. They were evidence. They were proof that I wasn't crazy, that everything that happened to me was real. Dad took my phone, forwarding every screenshot to his own number. Then he stood, gripping the device like it was a loaded gun. "I need to talk to the doctor," he said. "They need to document everything." I nodded. Then, just as he turned toward the door, he hesitated. Something flickered across his face. A hesitation. The thought. Then his voice dropped. "I need you to be ready, Kayla." I frowned. "For what?" Dad's jaw tightened. "For a fight." A chill ran through me, because I knew exactly what he meant. Mom wasn't going to let me go without a war. The next day it started. I was asleep when I heard the yelling. I blinked, groggy. The hospital room still dark except for the faint glow of the city lights outside. Then her voice, loud, furious. Mom. I jolted upright, my heart hammering. Dad was already at the door, his body tense. You can't just take her. Mom's voice was shrill, echoing down the hallway. She's not a thing, Vanessa. Dad's voice was calm, but sharp as a knife. She's my daughter. She's also mine. She lives with me. Dad didn't hesitate. Not anymore. Silence. Then Mom laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. You're out of your mind, Elliot. A judge isn't going to let you take her based on some ridiculous sob story. Dad's voice was deadly quiet. I have proof. Mom stopped. I could imagine her face. The way she'd blink, her lips parting, searching for a response. Then she scoffed. What proof? You want to see? Dad's voice was calm, controlled. Neglect, psychological abuse, physical aggression. And guess what? The hospital already reported the accident to CPS. Another silence. I held my breath. Then Mom's voice dropped. You're ruining everything. Dad exhaled a sharp laugh. You did that yourself. Then footsteps, coming closer. Before I could react, the door swung open. Mom stormed in, her heels clicking against the floor. She looked different. Her face was paler than usual, her carefully applied makeup slightly smudged, like she had been crying. I had never seen her cry before. Her eyes locked onto mine, and then her expression crumpled. Kayla. Her voice wavered. Baby, tell your father this is a mistake. I stared at her. The same mother who had left me in a hospital bed. The same mother who had chosen Ethan over me. The same mother who had called me selfish for wanting to go on a family vacation. Now suddenly she cared. She stepped forward, reaching for my hand. Honey, I know you're upset. I know you're angry, but you don't have to do this. Something inside me turned ice cold. I didn't have to do this? I clenched my jaw. You were going to leave me here, I said quietly. Mom flinched. Kayla, you were going to leave me behind, alone, and you didn't care. Her hands shook. You left me, Mom. My voice cracked. And now you're mad that I'm doing the same to you? Tears welled in her eyes. I made a mistake. I shook my head. No, Mom. You made a choice. A long silence. Then, Mom turned to Dad, her face twisting into something dark. You won't win, she hissed. Dad smirked. Actually smirked. Oh, Vanessa, he said, voice dripping with confidence. I already have. Mom's hands curled into fists. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. I barely had time to process before Dad turned to me. His voice was gentle. Let's go home, kiddo. My breath hitched, because I had never had a home before. But as I looked at my father, the man who had driven through the night, the man who had fought for me when no one else would, I realized something. I finally had one now, and I wasn't ever going back. Leaving the hospital felt surreal. Dad had packed up my few belongings. A phone charger, my worn-out hoodie, a book I hadn't even opened. The nurse had checked my vitals one last time, scribbling notes on her clipboard while reminding me to take it easy with my leg. But I wasn't really listening, because all I could think about was that I was finally leaving. For years, I had convinced myself that escaping Mom's house was impossible, that no one would ever come for me. But here I was, sitting in a wheelchair as Dad pushed me toward the exit, the automatic doors sliding open with a quiet swoosh. And then the night air hit me, crisp, cool, smelled like rain and pavement, like freedom. Dad helped me into the passenger seat of his car, adjusting my seatbelt carefully, like I was made of glass. You comfortable? I nodded, even though my ribs ached. Yeah. Then he shut the door and walked around to the driver's side. The moment he slid in and started the engine, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. We were really doing this. I was leaving. The hospital parking lot blurred past us as Dad pulled onto the highway, the streetlights casting long shadows over his face. He was gripping the wheel tight, his jaw clenched, his leg bouncing slightly, like he was running on pure adrenaline. I glanced at him. You okay? He let out a sharp breath. Not really. I frowned. Why? He scoffed. Because I just realized how close I was to losing you. Something heavy settled in my chest. Dad kept talking, his voice tight. I should have come for you sooner. I should have fought harder when she got full custody. I thought if I kept my head down, if I didn't push too hard, she'd at least be a decent mother to you. But I was wrong. He swallowed hard. And that's on me. I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long thinking he didn't care, that he had left me behind. But now, sitting beside him, watching the way his hands shook against the steering wheel, I realized something. He had cared the whole time. He just hadn't known how to fight. But now he was ready for war. The next morning, Dad's lawyer, Mr. Harris, arrived at the apartment. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. He spread out a stack of papers across the dining table, gesturing for us to sit. I've reviewed everything, he said, adjusting his glasses. And we have a solid case. I shifted in my seat, my cast resting awkwardly against the chair leg. So, what happens now? Mr. Harris laced his fingers together. We file for emergency custody. Given your mother's neglect, Ethan's behavior, and the hospital report, we have strong grounds. The judge will review our evidence and decide if you stay with your father until a formal custody hearing. Dad leaned forward. How long does that take? A few weeks. Dad exhaled sharply. And in the meantime? Mr. Harris hesitated. In the meantime, Vanessa is going to fight back. My stomach twisted. I already knew that. Mom wasn't the type to lose gracefully. She proved that 2 days later. Started with a phone call. I was curled up on Dad's couch, my leg propped up on a pillow, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when his voice sharpened from the kitchen. What do you want, Vanessa? I stiffened. Mom. I turned the volume down, my whole body on edge. Her voice was muffled, but even from across the room, I could hear the venom dripping from her words. I want my daughter back. Dad laughed. A short, bitter sound. Oh, now she's your daughter? Mom's voice rose. You stole her from me, Elliot. Do you have any idea what people are saying? Everyone thinks I abandoned her. You did. A pause. Then her voice turned cold. You're going to regret this. Dad didn't even hesitate. No, Vanessa. You are. Then he hung up. It only took 24 hours for her to make her next move. Dad was making coffee when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door. I froze. Dad wiped his hands on a towel, muttering, If that's your mother, I swear to God. He swung the door open and froze. 2 people stood outside. A woman in a crisp blazer holding a clipboard, and a man with a badge. Child Protective Services. My stomach dropped. The woman gave Dad a polite, practiced smile. Mr. Walker, we need to talk. Dad's whole body went rigid. What's this about? The CPS worker sighed. We received a report of parental kidnapping. I choked on air. She actually did it. Mom actually called the authorities on him. Dad exhaled sharply, stepping aside. Come in. The woman nodded, stepping in with the officer. She scanned the apartment. Small, neat, nothing fancy, but safe. Then she turned to me. Kayla? I nodded, my throat dry. I just need to ask you a few questions. Okay? Dad stayed close, his entire body tense. But he didn't interrupt. The woman pulled out a notepad. Has your father forced you to stay here? I blinked. What? She rephrased. Has he prevented you from returning to your mother's home? I let out a short laugh. No, I don't want to go back. She nodded, jotting something down. And why is that? I took a deep breath. And then I told the truth. Again. I told her about everything. Ethan. The rules. The punishments. Carter and Jake breaking into my room. The hospital. The vacation they left me out of. The woman's brows furrowed deeper and deeper as I spoke. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. Then, she turned to the officer and nodded. She's staying here. I felt my whole body sag in relief. The officer tipped his hat. That's good enough for me. Dad let out a sharp breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. The CPS worker turned back to me, her expression softer now. We'll investigate further, but from what I've heard, I see no reason to remove you from your father's custody. If anything, I'd say you're finally where you belong. My chest tightened. I belonged here. For the first time in my entire life, I belonged somewhere. The CPS worker smiled. You're safe now, Kayla. And for the first time, I actually believed it. The CPS visit should have been the final nail in the coffin. But Mom wasn't done fighting. A week after the investigation cleared Dad of kidnapping, Mom filed for an emergency hearing. She wanted me back. She claimed Dad had brainwashed me, that I was just an angry teenager lashing out, that I would change my mind once I cooled off. Dad's lawyer, Mr. Harris, was ready. Let her drag this to court, he said the night before the hearing. It's the last mistake she'll ever make. I wasn't so sure. Mom had always won. She had taken the house. She had taken me. She had convinced everyone, including Dad, that she was the better parent. What if she did it again? What if the judge sent me back to her? I barely slept that night. The courthouse was cold. The walls were gray, the air thick with tension. Mom sat across from me at the long wooden table, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She didn't look at me, not really, but I looked at her. She was dressed to impress. Sharp navy blue suit, diamond earrings, hair styled to perfection. She looked like she belonged here, like she was confident she would win. I clenched my fists in my lap. She still didn't get it. This wasn't just a custody battle. This was my life. The judge, a tired-looking man in his 50s, sighed as he glanced at the paperwork. All right, let's begin. Mrs. Turner, your lawyer may present your case. Mom's attorney, a sleek, polished man with perfect teeth, stood up. Your Honor, my client is a devoted mother. She has provided for Kayla her entire life. She's ensured she had a stable home, an education, and everything a child needs. I swallowed hard, my hands curling into fists. Stable? I wanted to laugh. He continued, pacing slightly. However, since moving in with her father, Kayla has developed an unreasonable resentment toward her mother. We believe this is a direct result of manipulation on Mr. Walker's part. Dad stiffened beside me. Manipulation? Was that what she was calling leaving me behind? Ignoring me? Letting Ethan and his sons treat me like garbage? My chest burned with anger. Finally, Mom stood up, and for the first time she looked at me. Her eyes were glassy, full of fake emotion. Sweetheart, I know you're upset with me, she said, voice soft. But you belong with me. I raised you. I love you. And I don't want to lose you over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. I stared at her. This was her final move. Gaslighting me. Pretending like I was just some angry teenager blowing things out of proportion. The judge turned to Dad's lawyer. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris stood up, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, he said smoothly, we would like to present evidence. He placed a thick folder on the judge's desk. These are screenshots of text messages from Vanessa to Kayla, dismissing her concerns. Hospital records documenting the neglect that led to Kayla's injuries. Reports from CPS. And statements from Kayla herself, describing the emotional and verbal abuse she suffered in her mother's home. Mom's lawyer stiffened. Mom's face paled. But Mr. Harris wasn't finished. There's more. He turned to me. Kayla, would you like to say anything? My throat went dry. I looked at Mom. She was watching me, her nails digging into her palm, like she was daring me to speak. I turned to the judge, and I spoke. I don't want to live with her, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. She left me in the hospital. She let her husband and his kids treat me like garbage. She didn't protect me. She never cared. Mom sucked in a breath. Kayla, I'm not a thing you can win back, I interrupted, my voice shaking with anger. You don't get to abandon me and then pretend you love me when you're losing. Silence. Mom's mouth opened, but for once in her life, she had nothing to say. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. I've heard enough. We waited. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears. Finally, he spoke. Effective immediately, full custody of Kayla Walker is granted to her father. Mom made a choked sound, her whole body going rigid. I let out a slow, shaking breath. It was over. I was free. Mom didn't say a word as we walked out of the courthouse. She just stood there, gripping the handle of her expensive bag like it was the only thing holding her together. She had lost. For the first time, she had lost. And I wasn't hers anymore. Dad wrapped an arm around my shoulder, guiding me toward the car. Let's go home. I nodded, smiling for the first time in years. Because for the first time I had a home. And I was never looking back.